Ennyi, hölgyeim és uraim.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Capandball here, your favorite gun channel in beautiful bright English language. And guess what? Today I'm continuing the project about the early 16th century tinderlock guns or snapping matchlock guns. Now these are very interesting guns, and now we are at the very point when we can start thinking about its ballistics. And in fact, this will be today's goal. Today's goal is to determine what was the muzzle velocity of these guns, because any kind of external or terminal ballistics reproductions can only be obtained if we know the muzzle velocity of the projectile. And of course, if we know the projectile, we know the powder charge, and we have a complete reproduction of an early gun. If you really like what I do, then please subscribe, like, share, and comment, because this will help the channel to grow, because the search engines are not on the side of the gun channels, even if they are gun channels dealing with historical guns like capandball. But anyway, we have a Patreon page, and the Patreon page is a beautiful place to support us, if you wish, of course. Here you will find many exclusive contents, in fact, about this gun as well. And we are also present on the History of Weapons and War platform, which is an excellent hiding place for gun nuts like us, with thousands of videos about historical guns. So it is really an excellent source of information. Now, you already know this gun that I will be using for these trials as well. So this is the reproduction of an early 16th century gun. The barrel is manufactured according to the artifacts that were found on the battlefield of Mohács. There was a great decisive battle between the Ottoman Empire and the Hungarian Kingdom in 1526. Now, the lock system is also proved by these artifacts, and also the caliber of the gun is proved by the bullets that we found on the battlefield, which are within 10 to 15 millimeters. And this gun has a smooth bore, just as the original ones, and it is 12 millimeters, so it is well within that range. The question is here that how we can set up a ballistics reproduction for such a gun when we don't have the muzzle velocity. Because before Benjamin Robbins in the middle of the 18th century, before inventing the ballistic pendulum, nobody was able to measure the velocity of the fired projectile. So we have to make a different approach here. So what can we do if we don't have a muzzle velocity, but still we would like to make a ballistics reconstruction? Well, the only solution we have here is to recreate each and every single element of the charge. Now, we don't have primary sources for the muzzle velocity because nobody recorded it, because nobody could measure it, but we have very good primary sources describing the bullets. We have primary sources describing the powder charge. So with this, we will have the three important elements for such ballistic reconstructions. The first one is the gun. We have the reproduction. The second one is the muzzle velocity, and the third one is the projectile. And we have the projectiles because we have hundreds of bullets from the battlefield. So let's start with the first leg. Let's start with the bullets. Large majority of the bullets recovered from the battlefield are cast round balls. There are some hammered lead slugs, also cut lead slugs, but most of the bullets are cast round balls. But their material is different than today's bullets that we use mainly for hobby muzzleloading shooting, because we use pure lead. But most of the bullets recovered from the mass graves and recovered from the battlefield are alloys. They are alloys of lead, tin, and antimony in different proportions. Alloying the lead with antimony and tin had a purpose. Of course, in the early 16th century, it was already possible to make pure lead. So why did they alloy the bullets with expensive materials like tin? To increase the hardness. And probably the reason behind this was to increase the armor penetrating capabilities. So alloying surely has an effect on terminal ballistics, but it also has an effect on external ballistics, because if we use the same diameter and the same powder charge, the lighter bullet, the alloyed bullet, that will be for sure faster, because pure lead has a density of 11.3 grams per cubic centimeter, but tin has much less. It is only 7.3 grams per cubic centimeter, and antimony, which is in very, very little portion in these bullets, it is only 6.7 grams per cubic centimeter. So which means that the alloyed bullet with the same diameter will be lighter. So it will utilize the force of the powder charge completely differently. So we have more than 700 bullets from the battlefield and from the mass graves as well. And we took around 50 of them to energy dispersive spectroscopy in the past years, and it revealed that very few of them are pure lead bullets, so most of them are alloys, what I just told you. Their size is mainly in 80% they are between 10 millimeters and 50 millimeters. So that seems to be the general caliber for the early 16th century guns in this region. So based on these examinations, I selected 5 of these alloys. 3 of them are surely Ottoman bullets. Why? Because they are sourced from the mass graves. We have 3 bullets from the number 3 mass graves. Now this mass grave is holding the bodies of around 350, 400 soldiers, Christian soldiers. So if there's a bullet in there, that means that it was fired most likely by the Ottomans. You cannot be 100% sure, but I'm 99% sure that these are Ottoman bullets. So we have 3 bullets from here.
The energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy was carried out in the quality control lab of Continental Automotive Hungary Ltd, a generous and very valuable help for a research team. The first bullet from the mass grave was a cast round ball of 11 to 12 millimeters with an alloy of 86% of lead, 13.7% of tin, and 0.3% of antimony. The second bullet was a damaged piece, once cast from pure lead. It probably hit a bone, so its original shape cannot be identified anymore. The third bullet had 94% lead content, 5.6 tin, and 0.3% of antimony. All in all, we were lucky, as all the 3 bullets had a unique alloy that will help us identifying the same bullet compositions on the battlefield.
We also have 1 bullet, or I selected also 1 bullet from the battlefield, which is the lightest bullet, which means that its alloy is more than 70% tin. So it's rather a tin bullet and not a lead bullet, and the rest is 28% of lead and some antimony and some other alloying materials. And the 5th was a normal linotype. And if you can ask why I chose the linotype, I chose the linotype because there's another research group that suggested that the linotype could be the ideal alloy for such bullets. It's a very hard alloy, so linotype is 70% of lead, 25% of tin, and 5% of antimony. Actually, we did not find that kind of alloy mix on the battlefield or in the mass graves, but I decided to test that alloy as well, just to give some answers to the other research group. So we have 5 alloys.
An important task for the further research was to determine the density and the hardness of these alloys. Mixing the alloys started with purchasing the pure ingredients. All 5 alloys have different density and different hardness. I started with casting round balls from them. The volume of the cast round balls can be calculated, and with measuring the weight we can calculate the density. The smallest density we measured can be associated with the bullet with over 72% tin content. It was only 8.2 grams per cubic centimeter, much less than the 11.3 density of the pure lead.
You can ask me why the density is so important in this question, and the answer is simple. Because in some of the primary sources we have, especially about the Ottoman guns, we only know the weight of the bullet. So we know that there were a 4 dirham caliber and a 5 dirham caliber. 1 dirham, that's a unit of weight, an ancient unit of weight. It is somewhere between 3 and 3.3 grams. Researchers usually say that it is around 3.2 grams. You cannot be bad with 3.2. So it's an ancient unit of measure, so which means that we know the weight of these bullets, a smaller caliber and a larger caliber, 4 dirham and a 5 dirham bullet. And if we know the density of the different alloys that they could use, then probably we can connect these weights to diameters, bullet diameters. And if I have the bullet diameters, then I will be able to calculate and to determine the caliber of the gun as well. So it is quite useful. By the way, these Ottoman guns, they will be covered in a later video, so be prepared for more. So the next question is the powder charge. And in my country, this is the more difficult part because you cannot just mix your own black powder because it is considered from one part in the legal system of the country an explosive. And if you do that, then you're doomed. So what we have to do in this case is to recreate the exact composition of the powder, which means that we have to read original early 16th century sources and select some kind of powder compositions that we will have to replicate, and we also have to find information how much of that powder was charged behind the bullet. So even if we know the bullet, we know the gun, now we will know the powder charge as well. And we are lucky because we have many primary sources for that. Now you can also ask why we don't just use modern black powder. And the answer is simple, because modern black powders are completely different. They are much denser than the early black powders made in the early 16th century. Modern black powders are made the following way. So we have the ingredients, we mix them in the desired ratio, which is usually 75% of saltpeter, 10% of sulfur, and 15% of coal. We mix them, and after mixing, they are wetted. This mix is wetted. They are very fine powders in that state, and then they are incorporated in a roller mill. So these roller mills, they were introduced in the end of the 18th century, which is already compressing this mix. Now, when this mix is compressed, the more time it will spend in the roller mill, the better powder it will be, because into the little cavities on the coal particles, the saltpeter and the sulfur particles are pushed in, so the ignition will be much faster and easier. And then the reaction will be faster, of course. Now, after incorporation, when this mix is ready, it is wetted again, and then little cakes are formed from that. Now, these cakes are compressed again. So this is a second time of compression, which means that of course, then they are dried, then they are crushed, they are separated by sheaves to different grain of powders, they are polished, sometimes they are coated. So, which means that the powder that the modern box of 1 kilo black powder holds, it is much denser. The density of that powder, any kind of modern powder, is around, let's say, 0.9 to 1.1 grams per cubic centimeter, while because the older powders are not compressed, they will be much lighter. They won't be that dense. In the early days of the military revolution, powder was not manufactured like this. So the ingredients were mixed according to the recipes. There are many recipes for powders for arquebus or arquebus, or escopeta, or scopietto, or scioppo. We can call it anything. But after that, the particles were crushed in crushing mortars. Now, these crushing mortars, they were actually incorporating the particles, but not as effectively as it is done in the roller mill. So, which means that the compression was already less than compared to the modern powders. Now, after the mix was ready, the more time it spent in the crushing mortar, then the better the powder became. The same reason as I told you in case of the roller mills. But when this mix was ready, it was wetted, cakes were formed, they were crushed, separated, but the cakes were not compressed, which means that the density of this powder is in fact much less, and that will affect the burn rate, that will affect many internal ballistics questions. So let's find out what the charge of this gun should be. So in the early 16th century, there were basically two types of guns, a smaller caliber one and a larger caliber one. But the larger caliber was also around 15 millimeters only. Now, if you check the Spanish sources, you can find that there are two calibers, a smaller and a larger one. The larger one was called the arquebus. If you check the Ottoman sources, you find the 4 dirham and the 5 dirham guns, and it is the same for the Italian guns as well, by the way. In the Spanish sources, you can identify that the smaller calibers one, with the caliber between 10 to 30 millimeter, now they were considered inferior, they were considered obsolete. The larger caliber ones, they were called the arquebuses. Now, they were the most modern guns, and probably this was the advantage of the Ottoman Empire in the Battle of Mohács, that they were using the same kind of arquebuses that the Spanish Landsknechts were using in the Battle of Pavia. In the Battle of Pavia, only portion of the soldiers used the modern arquebus. Most of them were still, or let's say, a large portion of them was still equipped with the smaller caliber escopetas. So if we want to make a differentiation between the two type of guns, then we can say that there was a smaller gun that had a caliber between 10 to 15 millimeters, and there was a larger gun with a caliber between 13 to, let's say, 15.5 millimeters. That was the arquebus, that was the most modern gun. The musket was also appearing in the 30s, 40s, but in very, very small numbers. So the musket started to spread in the second half of the 16th century. So regarding the Battle of Mohács or regarding the Battle of Pavia, we still don't have to deal with the muskets. So let's start with our Italian sources first.
The first one is Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who lived between 1439 and 1501. He was an Italian architect, engineer, painter, sculptor, and writer. He finished his book titled Trattato di Architettura, Ingegneria e Arte Militare sometime after 1482, in which he divided the existing artillery pieces and handheld firearms into 10 types.
Martini was kind to us because he did not just picture these guns, but he also mentioned what kind of charges they used for that, including the composition of the powder and the weight of the charge. Now, according to his description, there were two guns that can be considered handguns.
There is a heavy gun with 1 to 1.3 meter length, caliber equaling to the weight of a 6-ounce lead ball that corresponds to approximately 30.6 millimeters, so it is larger than an inch. The weight of the bullet was 169.8 grams, that is 2,620 grains. The weight of the powder charge was 50% of this, meaning 84.9 grams or 1,310 grains of powder.
Now, if you ever fired a large caliber muzzleloader, you know that this charge will break your shoulder. So, which means that this gun is a heavy piece. Probably this is the kind of piece that was operated by 2 soldiers and it was fired from a rest. So this is something like the, let's say, the early 16th century and 16th century Hakenbüchse or Doppelhaken or Volgan. So this is a different kind of gun that we are just searching for now.
The other gun is the Scoppietto. The name came from the Italian term for loud bang or thunder. These guns had a total length of 0.67 to 1 meter, while their caliber was equaling to only 4 to 6 dramma lead round ball. That corresponds to 13.3, 15.3 millimeters, and a bullet weight of 14.1 to 21.2 grams. This equals to 217 to 327 grain lead round balls. Their powder charge was 80 to 100% of the weight of the ball.
Interestingly, we have terminal ballistics information about the performance of the Scoppietto, and it's a contemporary source, because Pope Pius II mentioned that there are no armors that can protect against the bullet fired from a Scoppietto, which means that the small caliber bullets seem to penetrate the armor. Martini was a great guy because he also left us some information about the composition of the powder that was used for this kind of small caliber guns.
According to Martini, the powder of the Scoppietto was mixed from 73.7% of saltpeter, 15.8% of sulfur, and 10.5% of charcoal. Not far from today's ideal mix. Another excellent contemporary source is Niccolò Tartaglia's Questi et invenzioni diverse da Niccolò Tartaglia. It was written in the 1530s and published in the 1550s. He's providing recipes for arquebus and scioppos. Scioppo was the same weapon as a Scoppietto. All his special powders are high on saltpeter, with 78 to 83% content. He's stating that the saltpeter must be refined for these powders, and the charcoal was to be made from soft wood called nisoralo.
We can also find excellent information about the powder compositions in Vanocchio Bringoccio's Della Pirotecnica. That's a very famous book. That's a very, very famous book in the age about the use of pyrotechnics for military uses and for civilian uses as well. It was first published in 1540, and it mentions 2 kinds of powders for arquebuses.
Bringuccio's work mentioned 2 powders for arquebuses and scioppo guns, both with high saltpeter content. His normal mix of 83.3% saltpeter and 8.3% of sulfur and charcoal is the same as 1 arquebus powder from Tartaglia's book.
Let's check the Spanish sources we have. And this is quite important because if you check the tapestries about the Battle of Pavia, then the imperial mercenaries you see in the pictures, well, they are actually Spanish soldiers mostly. Let's see how the Spanish sources contribute to understanding the powder charge of these guns. Well, first of all, we have instructions from 1534 that tells us the composition of different powders that was used in the Spanish military system. Now, among them, there is 1 powder that is an arquebus powder, a dedicated arquebus powder.
The Spanish had 2 handguns in service in the first decades of the 16th century, and they are both visible on the tapestries about the Battle of Pavia. The escopeta was the older model, with calibers of 10 to 13 millimeters, and the arquebus was the more modern version, mainly with 3/4 of a Castilian ounce caliber, meaning that the weight of the lead round ball perfectly fitting the bore was 21.56 grams, that corresponds to 15.38 millimeters. The projectile fired from these guns was smaller than this, of course. The Spanish also had a smaller caliber. They called it the 5/8 ounce caliber that corresponds to 14.5 millimeters. The Spanish arquebuses were usually small, 0.8 to 1 meter long. The arquebus powder has the highest saltpeter content here as well. Interestingly, the coarser ordinary gunpowder has a near-perfect match to what we know today as the ideal black powder mix.
But the Spanish sources also contribute to understanding the powder charge of the bore, the exact powder charge of the bore. We have an order for 5,000 arquebuses and 200 muskets, and these muskets are new guns, so in the second half of the 16th century. So in the time we have the escopeta, we have the arquebus in the middle, and now we have the musket that we spread in the second half of the 16th century, so 3 different sizes of guns. But we are concentrating on the arquebus now. So this order was placed by the king to Juan de Orbel, a gunsmith, and it stated that the caliber of these arquebuses will be 5/8 of an ounce, which corresponds to around 14.5 millimeter diameter, internal diameter of the bore. And these guns were proved. They were proved with a double charge, and the double charge was double as the weight of the projectile. So if we start calculating, then we know that the exact diameter lead round ball's weight will be around 17.8 grams. So which means that the 17.8 grams multiplied by 2 was the proofing charge, and the service charge was the same, equaling the bullet weight. So this corresponds to around 274 grains. So it is a large powder charge. And this is why they penetrated armor, by the way. So this is the time when we can start making black powder, because we cannot avoid it. We have to make the early 16th century powders. But it is not easy, because I cannot make it, because I don't have a license for that. But there is one company in Hungary that has the license for making black powder. It is called Tűzmester Tűzjáték Kft. with an excellent leader called Lajos Vasas. He is an engineer, and he is very much interested in early pyrotechnics. And he made the powders for us, of course, according to our recipes. So I selected 5 of the most common arquebus powder recipes, and we made those powders.
Unfortunately, this is not the full version of the video, as it is against Google's content policies to show how we made our early 16th century gunpowders. If you wish to watch the full movie, please visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/capandball. The link to the full movie is shown in the description of this video. Making these powders took only half a day, but for me it was a very interesting experience.
Let me show you how easy it is to measure the density of the powder. So what we need for this is the gunpowder. This is our early 16th century gunpowder, one of them. It is granulated. We need a digital scale. We need a calculator. And we need a powder measure, which we know its exact volume. So this one is a Lee powder dispenser, and we know that it is 3.1 cubic centimeters volume, which means that this is a perfect measure for us. So what we do is measure 1 full charge of the powder. We shake it a bit to help it settle. And when it does not settle no more, we add some more. And shake again until it will be completely full. When you see that the particles are settled completely, you just remove what is not necessary. This is the one that we are going to measure. The weight of this charge is 1.83 grams. Now, this is what we have to divide. 1.83. This is what we have to divide by 3.1. And then we arrive to 0.59 grams per cubic centimeter. That's the density of this powder. Now, this measuring method must be repeated several times, and the average will be used in our final calculations. Now, associating the weight of the powder charge with the weight of the round ball was the easiest method for setting the powder charge. And it is quite easy, because if you have a scale like this, that's an old scale, and you put the bullet in one of the pans, and then you just start pouring powder. Then you will simply arrive at the exact weight of the charge. Very simple. So now we have written sources about the weight of the charge. We have written sources about the composition of the powders. But we also have one other type of proof that these kind of high powder charges were used for the arquebuses. And it is related to Hungary. In 1541, when our capital Buda was occupied by the Ottomans, in the same year the Christian army tried to regain the city. So they started a siege. It was not a successful siege, but during the siege there were some fighting on the river Danube as well. During the siege, a small military vessel, a Christian military vessel, sank on the Danube with all the soldiers and all the equipment. Now, the remains of these equipment, these artifacts, were recovered from the Danube bank in 1873, and all these artifacts, more than 50, are now in the Hungarian National Museum. There are 7 arquebus barrels, muzzle arquebus barrels, all has a caliber of around 11 millimeters, and out of the 7 barrels, 4 are still loaded. And I'm pretty sure that you already know these barrels because you saw my previous video about their examination, their X-ray and their CT examination. Now, out of the 4 barrels, we have one interesting piece that will help us to recreate that kind of arquebus load that is based on a cast bullet, because one of the bores is charged with a patched round ball, a cast patched round ball. All the others are loaded with cutlet bars and multiplied projectiles, so they are not interesting now. But the one loaded with a cast round ball, now that is interesting.
So the most interesting barrel is visible on the left. As we can measure the length of the powder column, and we can also measure the diameter of the bore, we can calculate its volume. And with knowing the density, we can calculate the weight.
So now, as I could calculate the volume of that powder charge, and with the help of knowing the density of these uncompressed powders, well, I was able to calculate the weight of the charge, which is very, very close to the weight of the bullet. So which means that this barrel from the Kopassi reef, from the city of Buda, from close to the city of Buda, that's another strong leg for that kind of high powder charges that are mentioned in our primary sources, Spanish or Italian. Now, after all this talking, there comes the most important part. Let's measure the muzzle velocity of the early 16th century Landsknecht arquebus. Now, that's what we are after, and this is why I'm researching this topic for many, many years now. Let's find it out.
The goal today is to measure the initial velocity, the muzzle velocity of the projectiles. We are only using lead projectiles, and the powder charge in each time will be the same weight as the weight of the bullet. That's very simple. That corresponds to the early 16th century sources we have about the charges of the arquebus. Now this will be very, very interesting, ladies and gentlemen. Let's charge. First we measure the powder. The powder charge we have here is an extreme volume because the density is only around 0.5 grams per cubic centimeters. Much less dense than the modern powders, which means that in volume we have to add much more. The powder charge is 132 grains in weight, because that's the weight of the 445 round ball we use now. Okay, and that's it. It's quite a large volume. Now comes the patch and the round ball. The patch is made according to the design from Martin Löffelholz, which means that it is lubricated, it is completely round, and it's cut from linen.
Martin Löffelholz wrote and painted his codex in Nuremberg in the first decade of the 16th century. And in his military codex fragments he displayed nearly all the accessories that we use today for muzzle-loading shooting. In the center of the picture you can see a circular patch pouch and also some patches cut from leather. There is also a little round container for schmear, or grease for the patches.
And just look at this, how much powder we have in that bore. The column is around 15 centimeters high. That's a lot. Okay, let's prime.
With all the 3 powders, I fired 3 measured shots, and I used them to calculate the average and the standard deviation to determine which powder was the best. I shoot a lot with muzzle loaders, but I have to tell you that shooting equal weight charges as your lead round ball puts your shoulder to the test. Definitely not enjoyable. But a man has to do what a man has to do, so I kept on firing, altogether more than 30 shots that day.
$507.
And the results were very surprising. They were quite high values.
So what was the muzzle velocity of a pure lead cast round ball wrapped in a patch from a 12mm smoothbore lunchnet arquebus? Well, if the powder was from a poorer quality, meaning that the proportions are not ideal and they did not spend too much time in the incorporating mortar, it could be around 450 meters per second. Now, if the powder had ideal proportions and the powder spent more time in the incorporating mortar, then it could reach 540 meters per second. So the range here is around 90 meters per second.
Giorgio Martini's Scopietto powder launched a lead bullet wrapped in a greased patch at an average velocity of 468 meters per second. Niccolo Tartaglia's Scioppo più Moderna powder achieved an average speed of 453 meters per second. The Spanish 1534 arquebus gunpowder was capable of an average of 460 meters per second. Vanocchio Biringuccio's Archibuso Scioppo propellant was capable of 440 meters per second. Powder number 6, the Spanish 1534 General gunpowder, was very impressive, capable of an average of 535 meters per second. Let's not forget that this powder had the close to modern mix ratio, and this powder's ingredients were incorporated in a roller mill, so this can surely be the high limit of the performance of the early 16th century powders.
I was very much interested in seeing how the lightest bullet, the alloyed bullets, worked with the same powder charge. Let's not forget that in each and every single case, the powder charge is connected to pure lead bullets. So I did not change the powder charge, but just simply used a lighter bullet, the cast alloyed bullet.
So this will be our last shot for today. And in the previous 2 shots, I was firing the alloyed bullet with the hottest powder that we measured today. And so far the results are between 560 and 595 meters per second, and that's the last shot. .592 fast.
The final result was surprising. It was the average was between 580 meters per second and 590 meters per second. Probably the highest was 593. I will, of course, try this later because the bullet alloys are very important in case of this research, so they will be tested properly as well. But this is high. This is nearly 600 meters per second. Just as a comparison, of course, that's a different type of bullet, different type of gun, but Mannlicher M95 First World War military rifle with its original bullet had a muzzle velocity of around 600 meters per second. So we are nearly in the same range, and that's high. That's why they penetrate armor.
And I told you that these charges are not a joke. That's how your shoulder looks like after 30 shots. I think tomorrow it will be, well, blue, green, something like that. So that was definitely a fun day. This was probably the first time for many centuries now that anybody fired the old early 16th century recipes for black powder. And I really have to say that altogether they performed much better than what I expected. With the lead bullets, with the 100% pure lead bullets, we had velocities between 450 to 550 meters per second with the different powders. And with the alloyed bullet, which is much lighter, which means that the powder can affect more force on it, or it can propel it with more velocity. The maximum velocity we had was 595 meters per second, which is nearly 600 meters per second. Well, that's good for a low velocity modern hunting cartridge as well, which means that we have quite huge kinetic energy here. That was very, very interesting, very, very interesting. And this is the first step to understand the terminal ballistics of these guns, because if we don't do this kind of experiments, we will never arrive to the point to understand what it does to the human body, what it does to an armor. So this was very, very interesting. So ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching the Capandball YouTube channel. If you like what I do, then please subscribe, like, share, comment. If you wish to support us, you can do it through patreon.com/capandball. Here you will find exclusive content from me. We are also present on the History of Weapons and War platform. That's an excellent hiding place for gun nuts like us, with thousands of videos from educational channels. So ladies and gentlemen, up until next time, stay cool and keep your powder dry. So ladies and gentlemen, the next chapter will be about external ballistics and accuracy.